I'm going to show you how to build my third workbench design that's super sturdy, costs under $200, and I'll show you how to avoid all the mistakes that I made when making my first workbench, including why you shouldn't use 2x4s. 3 work, 3 bench, Tokyo Drift. I'm going to use 2x8s for almost the entire build, but they don't need to be this wide, so I'm going to rip them right down the middle. Yep, I'm buying 2x8s just to cut them into 2x4s. Strange? Yes, I am strange. But it's not strange that I'm cutting them down because I want the top of my workbench to remain as flat as possible over time, which is one of the biggest issues I had with my old workbench. You can see that the top cupped about 1/4 of an inch, and trying to work on it nearly sent me into anaphylactic shock. Now, I'll get back to the whole 2x4 thing in a minute, but the first step to success is to make sure these are nice and flat. If you don't have a planer, don't worry, I'll show you how to laminate a bench top so that it comes out nice and flat, even without a planer. But what you should go out and buy is a cheap dollar store paint roller, because nothing screams quality like a pro painter $1.75 paint roller. But what this globe-trotting reminder of excessive trade route emissions will allow us to do is spread the glue out super fast so that it doesn't start drying too quickly and cause me to go into the hissy fit of the century. And the great thing is that I can just throw this away when I'm done with it. I'm not a part of the problem, you are. I grabbed some extra 2x material that's nice and straight, and I'll be using them as clamping cauls by cinching them across the top as I squeeze the boards together. This will take out any misalignment. I'm only doing the top in sections no wider than my planer can handle, because even with the cauls, I can send the result back through the planer for a smoother result. Nothing is more accessible than your local home repo, so let me show you what to look out for when buying the lumber for your workbench. You might look at the stack of 2x4s first and think, whoa, those are a good deal, but I always avoid them. See, most of these have this bullseye looking thing in the end grain called the pith. But why is that a bad thing? Well, the pith is the center of the tree, and because of the way that wood expands and contracts as moisture in the air changes, it is the least stable part, and including it in your project can really mess it up. Where am I? This is a weird edit. Whoa, back at the shop. You can see here that inexperienced Scott used all 2x4s for the workbench top. Most of them have the pith in them, so there are all kinds of delaminations and gaps in the top because the wood is warping as it takes in and releases moisture throughout the year. So if you see a 2x4 with a pith in it, avoid it. This is one bullseye you do not want. But even without the pith, 2x4s tend to be a little wetter because they are sold and produced a lot faster than larger dimensional lumber. Can I ask you a really weird question? How much faster do you sell 2x4s than 2x8s?
Yes.
Right on. Thanks, man. The beauty of something larger like a 2x8 is that I can more easily find one without the pith. Then I can rip it in half and end up with 2 boards that are going to be more stable and dry over time, which will result in a flatter workbench, which is always gooder. Now that the 2 halves of the workbench are cleaned up with the planer, it's time to glue them both together, and this time, although I'm only dealing with the one glue joint, the stakes are a little higher because there is no way I'm fitting this whole thing through the planer after it's dry, so it needs to be perfectly lined up. I drilled several holes for dowels along the sides so that the 2 halves of the top will stay aligned as I'm gluing them up. But I'm still adding cauls again to make sure that the entire top ends up as flat as possible when the glue dries. Belt and suspenders? Maybe. The height of the legs are going to determine the height of the bench top. I'm 6 foot and I prefer it to be 36 inches high. If you don't know what height you prefer, you can add or subtract a 1/2 inch for the workbench height for every inch higher or lower you are compared to me. So for instance, if you're 5'8" tall, then make a 34-inch high bench. Then just subtract the thickness of the top, which in my case is 3 inches, and that's your leg height. See? Leg day is easy. For the roughly guesstimated 40% of you that have seen my other workbench build, you've probably been screaming at your screens wondering, what about this beautiful ash workbench that I made last year? Relax, it's not going anywhere because it's still the bench of my dreams, but this build is not for the faint of heart. So I wanted to make a workbench that's easier to make for those who haven't yet abandoned their social lives for woodworking and metamorphosed into a crusty old hermit. It's also one of my best-selling set of build plans, so naturally, I'm turning into the capitalist I was born to become. So for my new construction lumber bench, there are plans for sale on my website, and the link is in the description. I am waiting for my dump truck full of money. Now that we've figured out the leg height, the joinery that we'll be using to connect the legs to the aprons is going to be half laps. And if you've seen my joinery test video, you'll know that the half lap is actually stronger than a mortise and tenon in the scenario that I tested it in. And it's a super easy joint to make too. Instead of cutting the laps on the table saw, you could glue this leg up in a way to naturally leave the half laps in place, but in my experience, this doesn't turn out as accurate as doing it on the table saw would. Besides, that would only work for these joints on the sides of the bench, and we still have to do more of these to connect the sides together. Like many children from a broken household, one big issue that this workbench experienced was a lack of stability. As you can see, I thought I did the right thing by adding this big 2x10 stretcher below, but clearly it wasn't enough. And now I know a much easier way to prevent this racking from happening. I'm going to lap in a few diagonal braces around the entire workbench, and let me show you why using my delightfully half-assed stick model. When you squish or pull a square from opposite corners, the distance between these two corners gets closer or farther apart. Now by diagonally bracing it, hold please. By diagonally bracing it, it prevents the square from becoming a diamond because you can't squish or pull that diagonal brace. The more bourgeois woodworker could use a track saw for this, but we can use a circular saw in the same way. The exact angle doesn't matter too much. I'm just going to lay my diagonal brace so that it goes from corner to corner without intersecting the top and bottom stretchers. Clamp a straight edge down so you can cut the inside of the bottom line. Now, the seemingly smart thing to do would be to offset our straight edge by the width of our brace piece. No, you must resist this urge because this doesn't account for the width of our circular saw blade, and if you did this, you would end up with too loose of a fit with the half laps. So we need to offset it by the width of the blade. First, I'm going to double side tape the brace temporarily up against our straight edge. Now I can take off our first straight edge. I'm going to use a 3/32 inch drill bit to simulate the thickness of my circular saw blade, and if you have two of them, even better. What I'm going to do is take the straight edge and offset it from our taped down piece right here, just like that, and then we can clamp it back down. Now we can unstick our brace, remove our drill bits, and place the brace piece straight up against the straight edge without the drill bits, and clamp the brace into place. Now we can go ahead and make another pass with the circular saw to establish the top of our half lap. That looks pretty good. Now we can take off the brace and hog out the rest of the waste with our circular saw. Now that both sides are done, I can join them together, and I'm going to use more half laps. Now, I'm going to glue them together so they'll never be able to come apart, but if you want to break the bench down easily, you might consider just screwing them together, although it might not be as rigid in the end. Now, a way to make life easier right now is to clamp both sides together, perfectly lined up, so that I can cut the laps that connect the long stretchers to both sides at the same time. Construction lumber can be super soft, but depending on where you live, it might be better or worse, but the stuff that's available to me is soft enough that I can dent it with my fingernail. So shouldn't a workbench be like super strong and super hard? Well, yeah, but also no. Yes, we're creating a bench with a super stout top and a sturdy base, and it's gonna be Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson solid. But sometimes a softwood top can save your butt. Let's say I'm working on a project. It'll usually be made out of hardwood because, you know, I'm super classy. As I'm doing my thing on a workpiece, I might, drop it on my bench because I'm classy and clumsy. Wouldn't you rather your bench take a dent rather than your workpiece? If it's something small, yeah, I can probably fix it, but it could also mean that I need to remake the whole part if it's bad enough. And I'm not about that. If you don't have a jointer, don't worry because I didn't use my jointer at all on this project. And as you can see, the top came out really nice without any gaps. And all I did was run it through my planer on each side. Now, if you don't have a planer, you can also still build this workbench, but you might end up with a little gap here and there in the top laminations. One big thing that'll help you out is applying a finish to your bench top. When you get drips of glue on the top as you're working, you're going to want to remove them easily, and if you put a couple of coats of a water or oil-based poly on it, the glue will just pop off like the youngins say. Be sure to apply finish to both the top of the top and the bottom of the top, or else the top might end up cupping. One more reason why my old bench top worked so much is because I didn't leave any room for the wood to expand and contract as it took up and released moisture throughout the years. Even worse, I think the wood was very wet when I made the top, which I subsequently lag bolted directly to the base. It tried to shrink, but the bolts were partially preventing it from shrinking, so the top did the only thing it could do and unintentionally turned into Tony Hawk's half pipe. To prevent this from happening again in my new bench, I'm drilling oversized half-inch holes through the top stretchers, but I'm only using quarter-inch lag screws, so there'll be plenty of room for the top to expand and contract. I'm also using a quarter-inch washer and a half-inch washer stacked here to make sure that the bolt doesn't get any funny ideas. The base is on its legs for the first time, and it's looking real good and it's almost done, but I think I want to add another brace to stiffen it up because it's just slightly racking. You probably can't see it on screen, but I think it could use one more. The great thing about this bench is that it doesn't cost a whole lot to make. I used 9 12-foot 2x8s that were $15.28 each. I used 4 8-foot 1x6s, which you'll see soon, that were $11.98 each, and some lag screws and glue, which brings the total to just shy of $200 to get you up and running. But there are a few things you might want to add to this bench to make it work smarter for you. A traditional front vise is still a great idea even if you don't plan on doing traditional woodworking because it's very versatile and can hold a workpiece in basically any orientation. These styles of cast iron front vises are very easy to install with 4 lag screws. However, I made a big mistake when installing it on my old workbench. Even though I had a vise mounted on my old bench, I forgot about one of its best features, which meant I couldn't hold a board flat down to the workbench. And it was such an easy fix, but because I'm lazy, I didn't do anything about it, so I just found myself using clamps to secure a workpiece flat on the bench. By drilling a row of holes in front of the vise, I can use the pop-up dog in the vise and one more dog in any of these holes to securely hold a panel or piece of plywood flat against the bench top, and I can work on it without it moving around. It's such an easy thing to do, and now I don't have to use clamps to hold it down flat because using clamps is time consuming, kind of annoying, and they just get in the way. This is the vise from my current workbench. I'm not gonna go buy a new vise for this bench because for what I'm using this bench for, I don't really need a vise, but be sure to mount it such that the top of the vise is flush with the top of the workbench, because if you don't, as you can see here, this dog barely reaches this panel right here, so that's a bit of a problem. So make sure to create a recess underneath the top so that you can achieve that. And I'll leave a bunch of links down below to some vices that I like so you can buy one for your workbench. Now, a lot of people use T-track on their workbenches for the same purpose, but I'm not a big fan of them because I find that the accessories for them are a little more limited, they're more time consuming to install, and they always tend to get filled with gunk and sawdust. But most importantly, there is one big issue with them being installed on a solid wood top like this. When the top wants to expand and contract as it changes in moisture content throughout the year, the T-track that's screwed across the top, meaning across the grain, is not going to want to move, which, like I said before, is going to make the top cup, and that alone is a huge reason to avoid it. There's always a big opportunity for lots of storage underneath a workbench, and for this one you have a few options, and the simplest one to get you up and running fast is to screw down a bunch of slats between the bottom stretchers. Now, to take it up a notch, you could make a simple cabinet out of some plywood with some simple shelving to expand the space a bit more. To make it even better, instead of shelves, you could outfit it with some drawers. Both of these options would be sweet but are a bit more involved and outside the scope of my build. If you go back and watch the video on my other workbench, you can see how I made that cabinet. Another thing you can do to make a workbench work better for you is to install some heavy-duty leveling feet, because floors are notoriously undulatory. It's a word. A thesaurus told me so. But when you're wrapped up working at your workbench and you wish to wheel it whenceforth to your wall, whip out the wheels and I can't finish that alliteration. You can install some flip-down casters on your workbench to make moving it around easier. I installed them on my current workbench, but I've only used them once when I moved. Otherwise, it just kind of stays where I like it. But some of you might not be able to keep their bench in the same spot, so they are a good idea for some. This bench is friggin' fantastic, and these plans are also friggin' fantastic, so go check them out and my other plans on my website, www.scottwalsh.co. Not .com or .ca. Some stupid web developer snatched up those domains. I'm not salty at all. Respond to your email, Scott Walsh.